I'm wound up. I'm wound up because it's another night for Con to share comics go to college with Stephen Bissette. We're so happy to have everybody here. We were just talking about the giveaway and how there'll be some other opportunities in the new year after this. This is our last one of this year, and we've had a great stuff so far. And if you'd like to see some of the back stock of what we've got here, since we're talking comic related things, you can go to jacksonconcon.org and check out the recordings of that. And I think we've also shared a form with people that have attended to look at the recordings of all of our past series. Concatenation convention is a convention that sees the two different things that come together to make a different whole. We talk about science fiction and fact and other pop culture media to promote science, math, and different forms of science. So we're glad to have you here. And Stephen Bissette has been a perfect candidate for that. But before we get started, I'm going to let Steve Tuckey tell you about himself, and then we'll throw it to Steve Bissette.
Sure. My name is Steve Tuckey. I'm a professor at Jackson College and one of a pair of professors who has helped put this together along with John Hart. And we're looking forward to continuing this. We've got, if I remember correctly, 4 more sessions in the new year, 2 in February and 2 in January. And those sessions you can get access to the registration for on the Jackson Concon website, or you can go to the bit.ly link. I put them in the chat inside here, so you can access them that way. And we strongly encourage you to share with others. It's completely free. We are a charitable organization in that we like to do educational work, and this is really about bringing people together and having fun, but kind of learning as well. And so I'm really looking forward tonight, where I'm going to get to learn a lot more about something that I don't know much about, which is manga. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Bissette, our lecturer for tonight. So Steve, take it away, Stephen.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. We would be very lonely without you. I want to remind everyone that there is a free giveaway tonight. I donated a number of signed books and graphic novels that I had a hand in. I will announce a break halfway through the talk, so that if you haven't filled out the survey, and if you haven't, the link is in the chat stream right now, and all you have to do is fill out the registration, and it's kind of a random raffle. Winners will be drawn from the folks who fill out the survey, and if you win, wherever you live in the world, the Concon folks will ship it to you, so don't be shy. I will be donating some more materials for 2022, so that there'll be some more stuff before we're done at the end of February. I will mention that this year we've had every one of these presentations on a Wednesday night. Starting in January, they'll be on a Tuesday night. The faculty schedules of the organizers and sponsors changed with the spring semester coming up, so we moved from Wednesday to Tuesday. So do please note that, and that'll be starting in January with the dates that are listed on the website. Every one of these presentations is recorded, as Professor Tuckey said, and those recordings are free and accessible to you at all times. Feel free to share those links with others. This was specifically put together to get this material and this information out there. It's as close as you'll ever get to having been in my classroom at the Center for Cartoon Studies for 15 years. And without further ado, let's jump into tonight's presentation, which is, here we go, Manga Before Osamu Tezuka. This is a prehistory. Now, I am from Duxbury, Vermont, and I am afraid that as a Vermonter, I am probably going to mangle every Japanese name and title that I'll be citing tonight. That is why all of them will be presented to you on screen in print as well. Please don't ridicule me. As I say, born and raised Duxbury, Vermont. So I do the best I can with what I've got. Also, another thing I will mention is this is an adult college level presentation. This is intended for mature audiences. While there are no sexually explicit or particularly violent images in tonight's talk,
Looks like we're getting a little freezing. We'll wait for Stephen just to come back on. I think it's Stephen.
Yeah, I think so. Give him a second.
I thought my phone stopped working.
No, hold on.
Always hard to tell who's freezing and who's not.
Well, he still has his screen shared, so that's a good sign, but we'll see.
And I'll message him too. I think what he was going to say, just for everybody's interest, is that there are some, adult content, and then there's some stuff that would be considered offensive to people, but it's for the purpose of talking about the content. And so it's not meant to offend anyone. It is just sharing what the content was and what it will look like after Tezuka. So he'll get back to you in just a second. Let me text him and just make sure, see what's going on.
He had mentioned before that he was interested in investigating. This is all historical, and so there's some historical contexts that are a little tricky, but just keeping in mind that we're doing that with the eye of trying to understand things better and understand the context a little bit better. So in the meantime, it's a perfect opportunity if you want to use this moment to fill in the registration form. The registration form you can get access to in the chat, and I'll put that in there one more time just in case. I think what I'm going to do is pause the recording until Stephen comes back.
Oh, got it. Many of these characters represent the Japanese cultural views of Western cultures, England, France, America, particularly amid periods of colonial intervention and rule, historical conflict. And there are some images from propaganda, both Japanese and American. Some of these images reflect prejudices, bigotry, ideologically motivated subjugation of Japanese, including pacifist Japanese citizens incarcerated by their own government during World War II, and Japanese Americans who endured similar during these periods of war. These historical images are unavoidable given the subject matter, and I hope you'll all understand that we certainly don't condone any of the attitudes reflected in these images. Okay, so if we're going to talk about manga before Osamu Tezuka, I cannot presume everyone here knows who Osamu Tezuka is. He is the father of manga, or as some call him, the godfather of manga. Born in 1928, passed away in 1989. He was born in Toyonaka City in the Osaka Prefecture, raised in Kobe during World War II. He started drawing his first manga when he was in second grade. He got very ill when he was a child and was saved by a doctor's caring attention. And that prompted Tezuka to enter the medical profession. He went to university to become a doctor, but he never stopped drawing manga. And he honestly believed that there was a way to use manga to convince people to care for the world. His first published manga was The Diary of Ma-chan, published in 1946. But before Tezuka could debut his first manga had to exist. So I'm going to start with the scrolls. Scroll proto-manga, I'll call them. They evolved into an early form of manga, started in Japan, and it was a portable form of narrative, textbooks, poetry, and artwork that could be sold and carried, and began in China, made its way into Japan. The Japanese adopted it as a primary means of communication. And they were called in Japan imaki, or picture scrolls. These were produced in large numbers from the 10th to the late 16th century. They embraced all genres: literary works, religion, biography, ghost stories, moral tales, romance, myths, legends, fantasies, comedies, you name it. There were imaki in that genre. They often featured a form of text in accompanying their rich illustrations. And as of 1962, there were some, quote, 600 scrolls in all, unquote, that were known to exist, with, quote, nearly 400 further scrolls, unquote, that were known to have existed but were forever lost. And that is according to Hideo Okodara in the book Imaki Japanese Picture Scrolls from 1962. This is an example of a scroll. This is the first scroll in 3. They often came out in series. And this is from the 12th century. And I chose this image from the Imaki book in my reference library because it shows you that it was culturally understood how to read these. They would be unscrolled and read from right to left, just as manga are in Japan. The opposite of the left to right orientation of Western reading and comics reading. And folks knew how far to turn that scroll. That means that no two readings are identical, right? Because everyone might turn it and stop at a different point. But there was a cultural tradition of how to read scroll. There were, just out of the ones that have survived, there were just an amazing variety of scrolls, including genres that just don't exist anymore. For instance, here's an image, an excerpt, if you will, from the first scroll of 3 of the Legends of Shigisan Temple. And this was a scroll that was created and distributed in the 12th century. And the hero of this scroll, I'm sure all of you are sort of scanning the image, trying to figure out where you should be looking. And if you go from right to left, you can see that all these human being figures are running towards something and reaching up. And the hero of this particular scroll is that rice bowl in the upper left-hand corner. This is the legend of a rebellious flying rice bowl that leads an army of bales of rice in revolt until it is pacified by a priest, Miorin, who commands the magical iron bowl and charms this little rebel back down to earth. Scrolls were popular among all classes. And according to the author of the book on Imaki from 1962, quote, from court nobles to warriors to the priesthood and the common people. My favorite of all the scrolls, given the bent of my nature, are the Gaki Zoshi scroll, the Hungry Ghost scrolls. There are a number of these. The earliest one, the Hungry Ghost scroll from the 12th century, has been attributed to the artist Mitsunaga. And what the Hungry Ghosts are if you don't live a good life in this realm that we all exist in the afterlife, you will come back as a hungry ghost, feeding on carrion and offal and feces and so on. And the Hungry Ghost scrolls were depictions of many, many, many hungry ghosts. There's also the Scroll of Hells from the 12th century, artist unknown. This was a series of scrolls representing all the different levels and realms of hell within their religious beliefs. There were also war scrolls. This is a section from the stories of the Heiji Civil War from the 13th century. There were romance scrolls. There were many scrolls about the life of Buddha or aspects of the religious life and so on. So let's jump. I mean, there were centuries of scrolls, and I could share many, many more images with you. I certainly did with my students at the Center for Cartoon Studies. But I will start with the print scrolls. In 1702, Shunboku Uka created the picture book Tobe Senkakushi, which started a fad in the Osaka area of Japan for Toba pictures, Toba-e. And what these were printed booklets which reportedly sold in the thousands. So let's mark this as the beginning of print manga. The floating world novels were novels that featured illustrated narrative pages which incorporated text, speech, and thought within the distinctive flattened perspective art. And this pair of images is from the Characters of Worldly Young Men from 1715. The artist was Kaseki. This is a replica that was created at some point during a museum protection of the actual scroll. So the text has been eliminated and just indicated, but you can see here where the text would have been positioned. Santo Kyoden, who lived from 1761 to 1816, is probably one of the earliest popular artists who worked within the proto-manga or manga form. It was not yet called manga, and I will tell you when we get to that point where the term manga was coined. The image at the center of this slide is one of the covers that Santo Kyoden did for Elegant Chats on Fabric Design from 1790. He wrote and drew in many, many, many genres, including witty books, which told stories about life in the red light districts, yellowbacks, which were illustrated satirical books for adult readers, and goken, or books of illustrated long stories, usually very moral in nature. And I have to thank Center for Cartoon Studies fellow instructor Jason Lutz for this material I'm sharing with you over the next 4 slides about Santo Kyoden. This was an artist who was entirely new to me until I attended one of Jason's classroom lectures, and with his permission, I'm including that material in this presentation with you tonight. By the time Santo Kyoden was 20, he had begun to write stories of his own. They became very popular. At first, this kind of work was a sideline for him, but the popularity of it meant that the weight of the work shifted from that of his being the illustrator and writer to his primarily writing, working with other artists. This is an excerpt from the story of the writer, an autobiographical work, struggling to produce stories by likening the writer to a pregnant woman trying to give birth to a child. And as a fellow creator, I can relate to that. Although I have to say, having had both my kids at home, however agonized we writers and artists may pretend to be, it is nothing like giving birth to a child. This is an excerpt from a satirical piece wherein Kyoden mocked traditional aristocratic social events by inventing a hand towel design competition. He went on to write and draw works in which satire was replaced with thick layers of ethical didacticism, including the Shingaku Hayasumukusa, a book based on popular moral lessons aimed at the urban merchant and other commoners. This stressed virtues like frugality, diligence, hard work to ward off the evil tendencies in human nature. This book's teachings complemented the Kensei reforms, so it found its place as an instructional guide for the moral education of children, which probably means this is one of the most widely read of the proto-manga because it was actually being, required as an educational tool for moral instruction. The Shingaku Kayasumi Kusa dramatizes, quote, the dangers of straying from the fundamental virtues, quote, unquote, through the conflict between, quote, good souls and bad souls, unquote. And they are shown here vying over the body of Rataro, the son of a merchant. From birth, Rataro has been protected by a good soul, but at the age of 18, his body is invaded and taken over by a bad soul. Rataro then enters into a life of crime and debauchery. Finally, he's rescued by a famous teacher who reveals to him the truths of the Shingaku. Rataro becomes a model young man and is forgiven by all. And again, this is per Jason Lutz, and it's quoted with permission. In a way, this makes this one of the first crime manga, if you will, with a mystical bent to it and a moral at the end. Best known to Western fans of Japanese art of all forms would be Katsushika Hokusai, who I will refer to as Hokusai from this point on. He lived from 1760 to 1849. He was a Japanese artist, an ukiyo-e painter from the Edo period. He's best known as the author of the woodblock print series 36 Views of Mount Fuji, including this very famous print, The Great Wave off Kanagawa. This was created during the 1820s. Hokusai was one of the first manga masters. The so-called Hokusai manga were published in 15 volumes during the Edo period between 1814 to 1878. They showcased over 4,000 of Hokusai's woodcut prints depicting, well, everything. By the way, these manga, all 15 volumes, were kept in print decade after decade after decade until the woodblock prints wore out. Here's an image of ordinary life. These are men at work. At top, you have men making twine. There are two men making noodles. A customer is being studied via hand glass by a fortune teller. There's a seated man using a telescope. There's a lens grinder and a trio of umbrella makers. But Hokusai also documented the extraordinary, including feats of magic, labeled here with the Japanese text, which identifies the feats, and I will translate them for you. Vanishing magic, sleeve magic, exhaling bees, vase magic, exhaling a horse, don't try that at home, smoke face, sword swallowing, and creating ocean waves from the palms of the hands. Hokusai also was a devotee of nature, and many of his multi-panel manga pages are not sequential narratives. What they are meditative panels showing different aspects of nature, and they are incredibly evocative and incredibly beautiful. Hokusai's manga were very rarely sequential in nature. And when they were sequential in nature, they were rarely narrative per se. They were not telling complete stories with beginning, middle, end. So these are not really manga in the sense that manga is understood today. For instance, these two pages that I'm sharing with you now were labeled Amaurosis and Blind People. So what these were character portraits that Hokusai had drawn from life, and he was simply using a panological page design so that he could include multiple faces on each page. But in other cases, Hokusai's manga were sequential in nature. For instance, this is the vertical and the horizontal face. This employed a two-panel split frame technique, a sort of cause and effect grotesque face making in a mirror. And it's interesting to me because really this is Hokusai's precursor to many of the techniques that anime used in the 20th century. Hokusai has a number of funny face portraits that appear in his volumes. These are sequential in nature because they depict various extreme and grotesque expressions and contortions that are shown in multiple images because they're showing the face making over a period of time, reveling in that comic distortion. Many of them are cartoony, like these that I'm sharing with you, but some of them were remarkably detailed. And again, don't try this at home. Concon is not responsible if you somehow end up in a hospital because you tried to imitate some of these Hokusai images. Some of Hokusai's multi-figure illustrations were sequential action portraits. This is a piece depicting the steps of the Yako Odori, which was a satirical dance of the period. Here's one of Hokusai's instructional manga. At top, how to disengage an assailant when you are grabbed by the collar. Middle right, another way to disengage a grabbing hand. Middle left, the 1,000-mile drag, a move used to capture an assailant. Bottom right, how to hold an assailant with one hand. Bottom left, how to prevent that hold. If you're interested in checking out some more of Hokusai's work, there are a number of collections of his work out there. The way I first saw this work was this book was in my local library up in Waterbury, Vermont, the Hokusai sketchbooks. And lo and behold, it was a book published here in Vermont as well. Charles E. Tuttle was one of the first American publishers devoted to opening up as much of the Japanese world, art, and culture as possible to English language readers. And his publishing firm was based in Rutland, Vermont, and Tokyo, Japan. So this is how I first discovered Hokusai's work. If you're looking for a one-shot book to pick up, Abrams published this book in 2007, and there are still copies out there. I don't know if it's still in print, but I'm sure you can still find a copy somewhere. It's a beautiful book. Okay, let's talk about the beginning of manga as we understand it today. And there was a strong Western influence that led to the birth of the manga industry as we know it. This is a February 1876 cover of the Japan Punch. And if you've never heard of Punch magazine was the premier British cartoon and satire magazine of the 19th century, and it's still published well into the 20th century and perhaps even today. I haven't seen an issue in Punch in quite a while. The Japan Punch was launched in 1862 by self-taught British expatriate cartoonist Charles Wergman. And this publication was not the only one of its kind. It was, in fact, a companion to the China Punch, which was the first cartoon magazine ever published in Hong Kong. Charles Wergman's cartoon portrait here that I'm sharing with you satirizes how Europeans looked to Japanese. This was atypical. More often, both Japan Punch and China Punch lampooned Asian culture and customs because it was a satiric publication primarily aimed at English-speaking readers and audiences. There was also a publication by another European immigrant cartoonist, a French cartoonist named Georges Bigot. This was published bi-weekly, and it was called Tobei. And it started in 1887, and Bigot was based in Yokohama when he was doing this publication. Each issue was 13 pages. I've never figured out how that signature would have worked for print. And like the Asian Punch zines, it was aimed at the foreign community, other expatriates who were living in the East. Nevertheless, all of these early publications profoundly impacted Japanese publishers, artists, and citizens. This is one of Georges Bigot's Tobei cartoons. This is from 1887, and what this is a cartoon lampooning a true life situation in which the Japanese police reprimanded the Japanese press, represented here as gagged editors and staff, and the policeman is using an issue of Tobei as an example of what the publishers were not supposed to do. And the caption reads, "Tobei at police headquarters, an actual event." And the trademark jester character from the Tobei magazine, a caricature of Bigot, the cartoonist, is looking in, smiling from the window. See, the problem was for the authorities, the budding manga industry very much wanted to be as antic and satiric and anti-authoritarian, if you will, as the Asian Punch publications were. Fumio Nomura found Maru Maru Chimban in 1877. This was a punch-styled weekly publication. It featured art by Kinkichiro Honda, who drew this cover that we're looking at now. By the way, I chose this cover because it is filled with puns, and these are puns that do not translate well. The Japanese government censored publications, and they would block offending passages or images with circles. And those censorship circles were called Maru Maru, hence the title of the magazine. And Simbun was a pun on the word Shimbun, implying strange tidings. The horse and the deer at the top of this cover on the left and right side symbolize the ideograms for the word baka, which meant foolishness. Until this zine, Panchi-e, punch drawings, was the regional nickname for Western style cartoons. However, this was the publication that popularized manga as the preferred term for all the cartoon arts. Charles Wergman and, oh, I'm sorry, I misspelled Georges Bigot here, were a direct influence on the manga artists they were contemporary with. And here's one example to prove that. This is a cartoon by Kotaro Nagahara. And this cartoonist was so influenced by Bigot's work that the top panel is actually a cartoon by Charles Wergman that Nagahara cut out and pasted in as the first panel of this strip. This is entitled Patriots of the Meiji Restoration and Today's Government Officials, a then and now cartoon showing how the hungry young idealists of the 1860s had become the fat bureaucrats of 1897. Rakuten Kitazawa lived from 1876 to 1955. I was born in 1955. And Kitazawa is going to appear a number of times tonight in the next few minutes. He founded Tokyo Puck in 1905, which was the first truly international manga publication which focused on world events. In fact, so international was Tokyo Puck that the manga magazine ran each cartoon with captions in English, in Japanese, and in Chinese. Covers like this one outraged the American embassy authorities in Japan. This is showing then current United States President Teddy Roosevelt trying to swat an anti-Japanese wasp that's fixed to the middle of his back, stinging him. This is a black and white reproduction that I found in one of the histories of manga, but I did want to show you, this is the kind of color that Tokyo Puck actually used. The interiors were black and white, sometimes two-tone color, but the covers would be in full color like this one. Here's yet another example of, satirizing the aristocracy, in this case, the British king, chewing at his own abdomen, trying to get at some sort of insect that's biting him. This is a four-panel sequence, self-explanatory, from a 1911 special issue of Tokyo Puck. The entire issue was dedicated to cartoons about women's rights. Women, of course, were very subjugated, put upon gender in Japanese culture at the time. And with the Western influence was only making that worse in many, many ways. And this cartoon very cleverly shows how a lot of women asserted themselves in the household. Kitazawa's legacy continued as he introduced one of the first, if not the first, American-style serialized comic strip. And this strip began in 1902, and it was called Togosaku and Mokube Sightseeing in Tokyo. This appeared in the Jiji Manga, which was part of the Sunday section of the Jiji Shinpo newspaper. In this particular six-panel manga, Togosaku and Mokube are shown trying to just get a drink from a street hydrant. They were country bumpkins, and they were baffled by city life. And every installment of this very popular manga strip would satirize their feeble attempts to try to accommodate themselves to the urban lifestyle that was so alien to them. And this means, in a lot of ways, this strip was in the style of the American comic strip from about this same time of Happy Hooligan. Ratuken Kitazawa expanded his reputation doing more and more different manga in Jiji Manga. Here's just two examples. At the top is a portrait of Doncha, which was a manga strip about a street urchin. There's a number of manga, one in particular I'll be sharing with you, that focus on children, usually impoverished children. And at the bottom is another one of Kitazawa strips, Haniko, And here the female lead of the strip is shown dancing the Charleston, yet another malign Western influence that crept into Eastern culture in the 1920s. Ippai Akamoto was also a key manga artist of the era. This example that I chose to show you is a self-caricature of himself trying to order crab at a restaurant in San Francisco. This cartoon was published in 1922. I chose this because I wanted you to be aware of the cross-cultural relationship between the budding generation of manga cartoonists and the Western influence often involved cartoonists traveling from continent to continent. Japanese manga creators would visit the United States and learn much of their craft from what they saw in American comic strips and newspapers, and then carry that over to their new manga that they were creating once they were back on their own native shores. I also want to recommend a book to you that I have not read as yet. This book was just published in last month. I have pre-ordered a copy. It has not arrived as yet, but I did want to bring it to your attention. Comics and the Origins of Manga by Ike Exner. There is the description from the Rutgers University Press catalog online. And this looks like a terrific book. And I wanted to bring it to your attention because I already had read in a number of manga histories and seen examples of how directly the influence of some of the early 1900s American comic strips were on the early 1900 manga strips in Japan. For instance, American comic strips were introduced to Japan on November 14th, 1923, when George McManus's incredibly popular American comic strip, Bringing Up Father, began serialization in the debut issue of the brand new weekly Asahi Graph. Notice the numbering of the panels, right? They did translate the word balloons in the titles, but they did not reorient the panels to the right to left reading orientation of manga. They numbered the panels sequentially, keeping the layout and design of George McManus's work in the American newspaper strip. And this meant that Japanese readers would have to reorient themselves when they were reading strips like Bringing Up Father. This prompted a media tsunami, if you will, of manga variations on George McManus's Bringing Up Father. For instance, Yutaka Aso had a very popular strip called Easygoing Daddy. This was launched in 1924, which was the year after Bringing Up Father was introduced. And it was very much a Japanese spin on Bringing Up Father. And notice that it was such a close simulation of Bringing Up Father that the artist kept the same left to right, top to bottom, American orientation of the comic strip. Another variation was by writer-artist Masamu Yanasi. It was called Bringing Up a Rich Man, which is not that different from Bringing Up Father, which began in 1929 in the American-style color supplement Yuri Sunday Manga. I could not find a color reproduction of the strip. I could only find black and white reproductions of the strip, but this will give you some idea of what it looked like. By the way, if you're not familiar with George McManus's Bringing Up Father, I've always suspected that George McManus not only had the impact that he evidently had on manga, but I would also argue that Bringing Up Father is sort of the beginning of the clear line school of cartooning that was so popular in Europe, thanks to Hergé's Tintin. The premise of Bringing Up Father was the nouveau rich, right? A poor married couple who suddenly come into an enormous wealth. They become rich overnight. And while the wife of the couple loves being wealthy, the husband does not change his ne'er-do-well ways and continues to sneak out of the house at night because all he wants to do is go and play poker with the boys and bet on the horses on the racetrack. And the strip's comedy derived from the kind of domestic abuse that arose from that kind of conflict within the household. This is also, however, the same manga publication that began to launch a greater diversity of manga strips in terms of subject matter. This is where Sako Shishido's action-packed strip Speedy was first published. This reflected the artist's 9 years of living in America, including while Shishido was living in America, he took a cartooning correspondence course, which were very popular throughout the 1900s, well into my lifetime, certainly. Notice the very inventive panel and page design here, but also notice the numbering of the panels. Shishido, unlike the last two cartoonists I showed you that were so imitative of George McManus's work that they kept the left to right Western comics orientation of reading, Shishido is presenting his manga in the Japanese manga reading preference of right to left. Here's a big one. Suio Tagawa, who lived from 1889 to 1989. No Americans I have ever met outside of the comics community, and specifically outside of the academic community that is obsessed with manga and anime, have ever heard of this creator or this comic character. But this character was as popular as Mickey Mouse in its day. The publisher Kodansha launched the most famous and popular of all the pre-World War II children's magazines. First, there was the boys' zine Shonen Club, which was launched in 1914. About a decade later, it was followed by Shoujo Club in 1923. That was a girls' magazine. And then Yonen Club in 1926. Every issue, which came out monthly, had over 400 pages of brand new original manga comics in them. And these were huge successes. The circulation was reportedly almost 1 million copies sold per issue. And among the most popular of Shonen Club's manga was Black Stray, a manga strip by writer-artist Suhio Tagawa. Tagawa's stories and art reflected a clarity and a calm which American graphic novelist Chris Ware envies. Chris Ware said, quote, "To me, this is the course comics should have taken before they got sidetracked and transformed by movies in the 1930s," unquote. Actually, American comics got sidetracked by movies as early as 1906 and 1907, just as American movies got sidetracked by comics as early as 1901. But I get what Chris Ware is saying, and this is the nature of the comic strip. Norakuro told the story of a clumsy stray dog who joined the Imperial Army, rose through the ranks from private to captain, and this very militaristic strip celebrated Japanese chivalry, honor, and militarism. It was not only popular, though, as a manga, it launched Norakura as the most iconic character in Japanese pop culture. In fact, Black Dog was as popular as Mickey Mouse and Felix the Cat had become internationally. This is a photo I found of Tagawa with Black Dog popular merchandising items. And if you've ever seen any of those vintage photos from the 1930s or 40s of a younger Walt Disney, you know, with a selection of the Mickey Mouse plethora of products that were out already at that time, it's pretty much mirrored by this photo. That wasn't the only strip that Tagawa did. He also created, wrote, and drew this very odd manga to Western eyes that featured an octopus character. In fact, the strip was called Octopus Hachan. And this also was a very militaristic strip. It embraced militarism, but its lead character was serving in the Japanese Navy. Octopus Hachan was created in 1931. Here's a page in which the cephalopod sailors are given clothes and shoes so they can fit in with human society while they're defending their native land. In one propaganda tale, Octopus Hachan trains other octopi to become naval officers. Yes, I know, octopi is no longer the plural of octopuses. I had to throw that in there. I love this artwork, by the way. And, you know, being an H.P. Lovecraft fan and devotee from about age 10, I would love to take one of the Octopus Hachan and transpose it with some Lovecraftian adaptation. Don't steal that, anybody. That was my idea, okay? I have witnesses here. Meanwhile, on this side of the Pacific Ocean, in San Francisco, Yoshitaka Kiani, known here in San Francisco as Henry Kiani, self-published Manga Yonen Shosei, the Four Students comic in 1931. This was not a little chapbook or slim manga magazine. This was an early graphic novel. He wrote and drew this innovative bilingual autobiographical manga. It was presented in book format in 52 two-page chapters. And it's available now in an English language edition. This is the cover of the English language edition, which I highly recommend. It details not only the author slash artist's life, but also that of three other young Japanese immigrants when they lived in America from 1904 to 1924. And during their 20 years here in America, they had to deal with earthquakes, riots, the flu epidemic, and the great 1914-1918 war, better known as World War I these days, in Europe. Along with the casual and all too common instances of bigotry and prejudice that shaped their lives and that they faced even after having served in World War I. In Japan, Shonen Club launched innumerable strips. I'm only going to show you a couple of examples. This is Dankichi the Adventure from writer-artist Keizu Shimada. And this was the story of a boy and his mouse sidekick who become the benevolent rulers of a Pacific island tribe. This adventure ran from 1933 to 1939, and it was so popular that it was collected into 3 hardcover volumes. But one of the most popular of all manga strips from this period was Ryuichi Yokoyama's Fuku-chan. This was the adventures of a spunky 5-year-old kid who stayed 5 years old in his newspaper manga strip from 1936 until 1971. By the way, Fuku-chan was so popular that not only did it yield all sorts of merchandising and spin-offs of the strip, it also spawned an animated propaganda film in 1944, a pro-military propaganda film, anti-allies during World War II, and decades later, an anime TV series in 1982. Fuku-chan was arguably a kind of manga equivalent to a lot of the American comic strips involving kids, like Skippy or Charles Schultz's Peanuts, with little Fuku-chan surviving decades by adapting to the changing times, all while remaining 5 years old. There were many, many, many popular manga in the 1930s. Kikyo Nakajima's lasso-wielding samurai hero, Hatanosuke of the Rising Sun, was published in Shonen Club from 1935 to 1941. This is one of my favorites here. Ooh, I have to move this somehow. Excuse me just a moment. Let's see if I can, oh, there we go. This is a taste of where manga might soar and did soar after World War II was over. And this was a science fiction manga serialized adventure called A Voyage to Mars. It was written by Noburo Oshiro, whose real name was Rokuro Kurimoto, who lived from 1905 to 1998. And it was drawn by Taro Asahi. And this was published in serial form in 1940. And I want you to take a close look at the color images on the left and on the right, because those images of Mars are actually photographs of Mars that were collaged into the strip art. A Voyage to Mars involved a boy who dreams that he and his cat and his dog get to ride aboard a rocket with a scientist traveling to the planet Mars. This was a very adventurous manga for its day. It depicted the technology involved in spaceflight as it was understood in 1940 in great detail. And the artwork, as I mentioned, incorporated actual photos of the moon and the planet Mars into the artwork. Pretty remarkable work in and of itself. The war intrudes at this point, and manga changed accordingly. Now, there were some anti-war manga published, but most of the manga published and popular during the war years were manga that got behind the Japanese war effort. The entire nation and culture of Japan got heavily behind their military. And it yielded strips like Mr. Promotion by Uchiyo Matsushita. This was launched in 1943, and this particular strip I'm showing you shows the little hero, Mr. Promotion, being inspired by news of the death of the National Pearl Harbor hero, Admiral Yamamoto. And he is so incensed by the news of Admiral Yamamoto's death that he begins to write anti-American slogans and get them out there to rouse the sleeping continent of Japan. This is the kind of manga that was huge throughout the war years. I also want to stress that for Japan, World War II did not start when we entered World War II. It did not start with Pearl Harbor. And of course, Pearl Harbor Day was just yesterday. It started with Japan's invasion of China in 1937. With increasingly fanatical militarists in control of the government, manga were mobilized with the rest of the country until Japan's defeat in 1945. Despite ongoing paper shortages, manga propaganda zines like Zosen Manga, edited by Etsuro Kato, promoted the war effort tirelessly, even as these manga were also instructional in nature in that they often were trying to warn soldiers and workers to avoid temptation, like, you know, don't drink. Alcohol is a bad thing to get into during the war years. This is a panel from a strip called An Elder Brother's Duty from 1944. Also during the war years, this is when Japanese giant robots were popularized, for those giant robot and mecha fans out there. Enemy stomping giant robots embodied both the zeal and, by 1943 to 44, the desperation of Japan as the tide of war began to turn against them. This is a panel from Ryuichi Yokoyama's The Science Warrior Appears in New York. And this is the Japanese giant robot stomping the hell out of New York City to turn the tide against America. And at this point, I will suggest we take a very short break. I will advise John and Stephen to get on so that those of you who either got in late or did not have a chance to fill out the survey form, if you're interested in winning any of the free signed goodies that the sponsors are holding for you, now's the time to do it.
This one is actually fun to look at.
While we take this short break, any other questions from anyone before we resume? We got a bit more ground to cover, and I'll be showing you some stuff, hopefully, that you've never heard of.
Stephen, we were SFT, Dr. Tucky there asked during that, when you were showing the Hokusai book, was that the James Michener that wrote that book?
Oh, yeah.
Know?
Yeah, that
Is
was
it?
the James Michener. Yes.
Huh.
That's amazing.
Charles E. Tuttle as a publisher was very well connected, and Charles Tuttle kept those kind of books in print for decades. Unfortunately, he passed away a number of years ago. The imprint is still going, and I presume his heirs took it over. I don't know. Much to my regret, my very good friend Joe Citro, who's best known as a Vermont folklorist. The first lecture in this series, I showed you my collaboration with Joe in the Vermont Monster Guide. Joe told me that there used to be a used bookstore in downtown Rutland that was the Tuttle Bookshop, where you could buy all the stuff that they print and publish, as well as all sorts of used books. And apparently it was one of the great used bookshops in New England. And I never heard of it. I didn't know it existed. And I first heard of it about 6 months after they closed their doors. So, you know, I still kick myself that I missed being able to go to the Tuttle Bookshop. But yeah, that's the James Michener. That's how well connected Charles Tuttle was as a publisher.
Probably saved you a lot of money.
Yeah,
Uh,
probably did. But you know, I
Yeah.
probably spent more money on that trying to get the books that I could have gotten in the
true.
Tuttle Bookshop for much, much less.
yeah.
Notice that Patrick in the chat said they used to have a Tuttle bookshop in Tokyo, which
Yes.
he misses. So that's
Yes,
really
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, they were based in Tokyo and Rutland, Vermont. And it still cracks me up when I open any one of their books. And it's, you know, Charles E. Tuttle, publisher, Rutland, Vermont, Tokyo, Japan. What?
Hey,
Amazing.
well, I was going to ask you because you mentioned Rutland a bunch of times, and I know through one of the people that have been active with some comic stuff that I've been doing on the other side, that Rutland is the
Halloween play.
the Halloween parade place. And it was coming to my mind, was that influenced by any of that activity in that early
You know,
comic
I
stuff? Because
actually-
I was not aware of Hokusai's early publication like that. I had no idea.
I actually bought the issue of it was either Detective Comics or Batman. It was one of the Neil Adams artwork issues that's set in Rutland, Vermont during the Halloween parade. And I actually bought that in Brattleboro, Vermont at Moondance Comics when I was going to Alan Goldstein's Moondance Comic Shop there in Brattleboro. I'm not sure who's doing it now. I know that I've seen at least one art exhibition at the Center for Cartoon Studies of comic book pages and panels from comic stories set in Rutland, Vermont during the Halloween parade. Because a lot of the writers and artists, you know, Jim Starlin, Bernie Wrightson, Neil Adams, who were working for DC and Marvel during the 70s, used to go to that Halloween parade because they used to there was a lot of what is now called cosplay and a lot of comic related floats and so on that were part of the parade. I don't know if they still do it. I'm sure somebody can find out and let us know.
Yeah, no, they still do it because there was a group called Tysos, which was one of the early fan club groups out of New York. And one of the there's a professor that I know from Ypsilanti, and he was a member of that, and he was friends with Bernie Wrightson. And two of the members are actually the models for Cain and Abel.
Hey, there you go.
Because Bernie knew him.
Right,
yeah. And
right.
so I guess the guy that did the parade has died recently, maybe 5 years ago. They just put a statue up of him in Rutland. And now it's become more like a community group that's running that parade. But anyways,
I should have spent more time in Rutland, clearly.
There you go, man.
All right.
Apparently John Deere of John Deere tractor fame was from Rutland as well.
Is that right? Who knew? Who knew?
It's crazy.
Well,
it's a small world, but I wouldn't want to paint it. So
shall we continue, folks? Shall we continue?
Definitely. Just one last plug. I'll put the drawings registration link in the chat. Make sure that if you haven't already, you fill that out because we're going to be doing the drawings at the end.
And I donated some really cool stuff to the
Definitely.
sponsors for this drawing. They're all in mint condition and they're all signed. So there you go. All right. Well, let's continue. Even as American comic books were viciously caricaturing the Japanese with these kind of savage xenophobic stereotypes, manga cover artist and editor Hadizo Kondo was doing the same thing in manga, targeting, quote, the satanic Americans and British, unquote. Now, some of these wartime manga caricatures attacking the Allies were rendered with considerable subtlety. This one from 1944. I love that Winston Churchill, well known for being in his cups, is shown adrift here in American President FDR's drink, while others were rendered with blunt forcefulness. Here's FDR as a fanged monster. Okay, I want to bring to your attention some manga creators who I do not read much about and I do not find much about, although I have to note that the British comics historian and author and curator Paul Gravett has done much to bring their work to international attention. These are both, what I'm about to show you are two books that I found when I was a teenager, again, in local libraries. Taro Yoshima's self-portrait is shown here, gracing the cover of his American published manga graphic novel, The New Sun. He was born in 1908 in Kagoshima. He was the son of a doctor. After high school, he attended the Japanese Imperial Art Academy, but he was expelled from the academy because he refused to attend a military drill. And as Japan was gearing up to begin what became the Second World War, the entire culture was pulled toward militarism. It permeated every aspect of Japanese life. And Taro Yoshima was against that. He was a pacifist by nature and rejected his native country's embracing of such rampant militarism. While at university, he married another young artist, and both husband and wife were pacifist and became anti-war activists after 1937. Yoshima and his wife were jailed 10 times for their activism and their pacifism, and they lost 2 sons while still living in Japan. They eventually moved to America, where Henry Holt and Company editor Tobias Moss seized on Taro Yoshima's graphic novel manuscript, The New Sun, and accepted it for publication. And this was published here in America in 1943, 2 years after we had entered World War II. Here from the back end flap of the dust jacket for the book, I scanned off my copy, the biography of Taro Yoshima. I want to note for you that this was a highly unusual book for a mainstream New York City publisher to be publishing at any time, much less during the war. Now, I'm sure that one of the rationales for publishing this book was that it both humanized Japan and pointed out to American potential readers that not all Japanese were embracing the militarism that had led to World War II. But it also had to have served as a form of propaganda, an anti-Japanese form of propaganda, because this is a harrowing account of what happened during those incarcerations, including in the New Sun, in this book, the ordeal that he and his pregnant wife suffered in Japan in the 1930s when they were imprisoned as anti-military dissidents. At one point in the graphic novel, by the way, I call it a graphic novel, I should call it a proto-graphic novel. All of the artwork is done with brush and ink. There's one illustration per page and one block of text at the bottom of each illustration per page, which is a rather static approach to what became graphic novels. But nevertheless, this is an incredibly adventurous and intense work, particularly for 1943. During the incarceration, he is separated from his wife, and he shivers in his cell as he listens to her being raped by the guards, knowing that the rape will probably cost them the life of the unborn child that she carries. This was published in 1943, even as Japanese Americans were being imprisoned here in the United States in so-called detention camps. Between 1942 and 1945, a total of 10 camps were opened here in the United States of America, ended up incarcerating approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans who lost everything, their homes, their property, their businesses. And they were held for varying periods of time in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Arkansas. One of the Japanese Americans who was incarcerated in those Japanese American camps was a woman who was also an artist. Her name was Mine Okubo. She was a Japanese American artist. She had been freelancing for a number of magazines, including Fortune magazine. She illustrated the April 1944 issue of Fortune that had a featured cover article on Japan. And this was published right after Okubo's release from one of the Japanese internment camps. She and her family were first imprisoned in Tanforan, California, and then they were moved to Topaz, Utah. And Mine recorded her experience in sketches, drawings, journal entries, and paintings. And after her release, she formatted those recollections into a graphic novel, an autobiographical graphic novel published as Citizen 13660. This was first published in 1946, 3 years after The New Sun, by Columbia University Press. And thankfully, it has been reprinted a number of times since. There is a current new edition out now. This is what it looks like. I wanted to show you some sample interior pages so you could see Mine's artwork. Much like The New Sun, there is one drawing per page with a block of text at the bottom of each page. So it's not, you know, technically a graphic novel. Arguably, some people might tussle with my using the term manga. But to me, it fits the bill. And it's an incredibly introspective and vivid account of what happened to Mine and her family. It's very carefully told. Mine was being published by an American publisher, so even though it's quite candid about the nature of the evacuation orders and how the Japanese Americans were being treated at the time, it also tries to put as heartfelt and positive a spin on the experience as is humanly possible, but is a brilliant, essential piece of work. And I would argue that anybody on any level, whether you're a fan, a casual comics reader, a fellow creator, a fellow academic, I mean, both these works, The New Sun and Citizen 13660s, are books you should know and hopefully track down and own and read. Mine Okubo once said, "To me, life and art are one and the same, for the key lies in one's knowledge of people and life. In art, one is trying to express it in the simplest imaginative way, as in the art of past civilizations, for beauty and truth are the only two things which live timeless and ageless." She lived from 1912 until 2001, and this book, Mine Okubo, Following Her Own Road, was published by University of Washington Press in 2008. And if you're interested in finding out more about this woman, this amazing artist, I highly recommend this book. Also during World War II, not all the Japanese Americans that were working in the comics industry were so moved to present autobiographical work. Many of them were working in the comic book industry itself. Japanese-Irish American cartoonist Bob Fujitani drew patriotic superheroes like Shock Gibson, master of electronics, in American comics like Speed Comics. Here's a page from Speed Comics number 38, which Shock Gibson saves his platoon from the Japanese military. Though the most popular Japanese comic strip, Fuku-chan, had joined the anti-American, anti-British fervor. In fact, the title of the strip changed to Advance Little Fuku. And Fuku-chan was, from his creation in the 1930s, well known for the ABC pattern that was written on the robe that he wore. And during the war, that ABC was changed to 1, 2, 3, because in Japanese culture, ABC had come to stand as an acronym for the Allied foe, America, Britain, and China. Oddly enough, after the war, Fuku-chan instantly went from being one of the propaganda tools that was pro-military to Japan and manga's first diplomat, as evidenced by this very rare 1946 publication that was published and specifically aimed at English readers to raise money for Japanese war orphans. A little bit about this manga. I found it at a flea market in Wilmington, Vermont, where I lived back in the 80s and early 90s. There was a table at the Wilmington flea market where a family had set out the remaining military garb and accoutrements of some family member who was either aging or had recently passed away. A helmet, you know, camouflage clothing, boots. And there, in the middle of it, I see this little comic. And I pick it up and I realize what it is. I've never heard of it before. I'd never heard of Fuku-chan before that flea market. But I picked it up, and being a veteran flea marketer, you keep a poker face. You never betray excitement at anything you find. I kept it in my hand, and I reached over to a couple other things, and I asked for the prices on a couple of items. And then I held out the comic and said, "How much is this?" And they said, $5. And I don't dicker at flea markets, right? I pay what people are asking. For $5, this was just a phenomenal find. So what is this book? Well, let me show you what this book is. This is an English language translation of Fuku-chan. The original Japanese text is on the right of each panel, but it's been reformatted to the left to right orientation of English language readers. And it's a straightforward translation of very innocent, innocuous Fuku-chan strips. But it ends the book opens with this introductory page, which is quite remarkable. It's addressed to the Allied occupation forces. And this intro page explicitly states the intentions of this manga collection, why it exists. Recently, a club has been organized among my friends in order to provide these poor friends of Fuku-chan with healthy books. Children who are now deprived of their parents, their homes, food, clothing, toys, candies, books, and other necessaries of life ought to be entitled to at least a certain number of books as a mean to regain the full glory of their childhood. The translation into English of Fuku-chan of the comics, therefore, has the double purpose of introducing this cute little representative of the Japanese kiddies to you, and of using the profit therefrom for the above stated purpose of the club. With much pleasure, then, do I mention here that such a dream of mine has already been placed on its first stage toward realization, thanks to the full endorsement, consent, and support of no other than the author of Fuku-chan himself. Someday, when we shall again be permitted to visit your country, I do hope to send you our beloved Fuku-chan of the comics and make him get acquainted with your children, contributing thus toward the mutual understanding and goodwill of the respected circles of children. Allow me then to cherish this as my next ambitious dream to be realized someday, somehow. This is a remarkable artifact. And it is a fascinating precursor to what Osamu Tezuka was going to do the very next year. Now, the first manga that was actually published that was written and drawn by Tezuka was called The Diary of Ma-chan, and it came out in 1946. And I will quote again my fellow Center for Cartoon Studies instructor, Jason Lutz. Jason, by the way, is the creator of Berlin, Jar of Fools, just a terrific graphic novelist in his own right. Brilliant, brilliant cartoonist and storyteller, and a great, great teacher. Jason has always been inspired by the work of Tezuka. Quote, at one point in his childhood, Tezuka had fallen badly ill and was treated and cured by a doctor who inspired him to go on to study medicine. Tezuka continued to draw comics while in medical school, and it was during this period that his first professional work was published. This was Diary of Machan, a 4-panel newspaper strip that related the gag-driven exploits of a boy growing up in post-war Japan, unquote. This is Tezuka's Fuku-chan. But this isn't the strip that changed manga and changed the world. The very next year, Tezuka's first manga novel was published. Now, while he was making his first work, I'm again quoting Jason, Tezuka, quote, found himself facing a difficult decision to continue studying medicine and become a doctor, or to pursue his passion for writing and drawing comics. He asked his mother for advice, and she told him, you should do the thing you enjoy doing most of all. Taking this advice to heart, he decided to finish his university education, but began work on another project at the same time he was producing the Diary of Machan. It was something bigger, something that would take his love of cinematic animation and apply it to the printed page, unquote. Now, before I jump to what that first seminal complete work was, I want to remind all of you that there was an anime industry going back to the silent era in Japan. Animated cartoons were a staple of the Japanese cinematic industry. Much of that animation, like the manga strips I have shared with you here tonight, were geared toward propaganda starting in 1937 and Japan's entry into the war. And during that time that Japan was in the arena of war, all the animation that was being produced in America stopped being exported to Japan. This means that the first Walt Disney animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, was not shown in Japan. It was part of the American product line that was shut down during the war years. This means that Fantasia, Pinocchio, all the color Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse cartoons, all the Fleischer Brothers Superman cartoons, these were not shown in Japan until after the end of the war. And starting with the end of the war, particularly heating up in 1946 and 47 during the American occupation, all that backlog of American media flooded into Japanese theaters. In fact, at a certain point, it threatened to usurp Japan's ability to make motion pictures because the theaters were being glutted with American product. But that means that young artists like Osamu Tezuka were suddenly hit with a mind-blowing tsunami of American pop culture, including a lot of cutting-edge animation that had gradually come out between 1938 and 1945, but had been held back from Japanese audiences until after the war. Tezuka revered the Walt Disney animated cartoons. He revered Walt Disney. And that influence of American animation on Tezuka's manga dramatically altered his work. And that is what made his first book format manga, Treasure Island, published in 1947, so unlike any other manga that had been seen before in Japan. Everything about manga changed and exploded with the appearance of then 20-year-old Osamu Tezuka's first popular manga creation, Treasure Island. It was a 200-page original manga, and even though it's named Treasure Island, it's not really an adaptation of the Robert Louis Stevenson novel. What Tezuka would do is take the titles of literary works that he loved and then just make up whatever he wanted to make up to create a new adventure in the manga form. The sales for Treasure Island have been estimated at 400,000 to 800,000 copies sold. And this is at a time when a lot of those copies were sold for lending libraries. Tezuka's manga forever changed the manga medium and the manga industry. His next book was The Lost World, published in 1948, also an instant bestseller. And Yoshiro Tatsumi's autobiographical graphic novel, A Drifting Life. Tatsumi recalls how vital the first appearance of Tezuka's The Lost World was for manga readers in December of 1948. And Tatsumi also details in A Drifting Life how manga were distributed and read and collected at this time. So if you want to find out more about the impact of Tezuka's initial work, I highly recommend you get your hands on A Drifting Life. It's in print here in America, easily found online, and very highly recommended. It will tell you all you need to know about how Tezuka's manga changed forever the manga industry. By the way, there is an English language version that was published by Dark Horse Comics here in the US of Tezuka's Lost World. Of course, I had to buy it. It's The Lost World. Look, there's a dinosaur on it. It has almost nothing to do with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912 novel, which I think I was talking about just last week here with you all. Tezuka's animation type drawing style and the very fast-paced sequencing were real innovations at the time and revolutionized manga, reinvigorating the industry and inspiring an entire new generation of manga creators. The next of the Tezuka manga novels was Metropolis, published in 1949. Again, the title being lifted from the Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbo UFA German science fiction film from the silent era, but it really doesn't have much of anything to do with Fritz Lang's Metropolis. It's Tezuka's Metropolis. Some of you may be familiar with the anime that the creator of Otomo made, I don't know, about 15 years or more ago. But if you're interested, I recommend you track down a copy of Metropolis in whatever language you prefer to read it in. And the rest, as they say, is history. I want to thank Jackson College, Jackson District Library, Nostalgia Inc., and ConCon for sponsoring this online lecture series, as always. Very special thanks to my friend Jason Lutz for his generous permission to include and quote some of his own original lecture material, research, and observations. I owe a huge debt to the Center for Cartoon Studies. This is a revised and expanded version of a lecture I used to present in my classroom there at CCS. I also have to thank the CCS students and alumni. They taught me so much about manga. The current generation of cartoonists know so much more about manga than I ever will. And that's part of the reason this lecture stops at the year 1949, because I am a dinosaur, folks. I also want to thank and have to acknowledge the pioneering English language studies of manga by Vernon Grant, American-born cartoonist who was serving in the US Army, who I believe wrote the first English language analysis of manga while he was stationed in Tokyo back in the 1960s. Hideo Okadara, Dr. Frederick L. Schote, who has written and or edited and or curated most of the early English language books on manga. Helen McCarthy, Jonathan Clements, Paul Gravett, who I mentioned earlier. Thank you, Paul. And many, many others, including Charles E. Tuttle, the Vermont-based publisher that we talked about during the break. Special thanks to John Chad. Hey, John. Scott McLeod. I don't get to see you much these days, Scott, but I owe it all to you, this interest in manga. And my very good friend, Tim Paxton. We have a shared love for a lot of this work. And all my manga loving peers and friends. And there's a list of my current published works at the bottom of the screen here. I've got 2 new sketchbooks out right now, Brooding Creatures and Thoughtful Creatures. If you enjoy these lectures, you can visit the recordings and find these works. They're listed at the end of every lecture, and that's my shameless hucksterism for the evening, ending with reminding you that all of these online lectures have been recorded and they're all available to you free online. Please share the links with friends, associates, and anyone you think might be interested. They'll be up as long as Jackson College keeps them up there. And with that, I will turn this over to Stephen and John, and we can switch over to some Q&A and I will stop sharing my screen at this point in time.
Thanks, Steve. Man, that was great. That was striking me at the very end there. The Tezuka was like, I kind of can see that Matt Wagner was totally influenced by that work
Oh,
when he was doing Grendel.
not
I
just
never
Matt Wagner.
knew
I mean,
that.
Matt
Yeah,
Wagner, Frank Miller during his
Yeah.
run on Daredevil.
for
I mean,
sure.
manga began to bleed into American pop culture before American comics picked it up. I'll remind all of you that the first popular television anime series was created and produced by Tezuka, and it was released here as Astro Boy. And it debuted on the NBC network when there were only 3 networks here in America. NBC picked it up for Saturday mornings, and that was within a year of its debut in Japan back in 1964. And I was one of those kids. I was 9 years old when Astro Boy was on TV, and I never missed it. Any Saturday we were home, I watched Astro Boy. And I would mark that as the beginning of manga bleeding into American pop culture, because that was an anime series that Tezuka himself supervised, produced, and shepherded. And we were seeing it within a year of its creation and debut in Japan, which is phenomenal to me. There were also, I mean, a lot of people forget this today or never knew it. There were a number of anime feature films that actually played in theaters here in America in the 60s. The first of them was a film that played here as Panda and the Magic Serpent, and it was the first full-color anime feature. It was produced by Toei Studios, T-O-E-I, and it had been produced and released in Japan at the end of the 1950s. It didn't pop up here in America until the early 60s. And then American International Pictures actually released the first color animated feature that Tezuka had a hand in, which was the Monkey King story, but it was released in America as Alakazam the Great. And typical America, you know, they had Frankie Avalon dub the voice. Frankie Avalon from the Beach Party movies dubbed the voice of Alakazam the Great. But Tezuka was involved in that production. He was not happy with the film. In fact, one of the reasons Tezuka launched his own anime production studio is because of his unhappiness with that particular feature film. So we were seeing anime in America, you know, during the 1960s. Within a year to 5 years of these works coming out in Japan, they were coming to America in dubbed form. Manga did not make their way to America until the 70s. The first manga I ever saw was I Saw It, which was, you know, the Gen of Hiroshima account of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And it was published in America as an underground comic book by Edu Comics, by Leonard Rifus in the early 70s. And that was the beginning of manga being translated and you know, available here in the United States. So, but yeah, John, you know, Matt Wagner, Frank Miller, you know, we could list a number of people whose work had been impacted by manga. And by the time you have works out there like Ronin, you know, the DC Prestige series that Frank Miller did right before The Dark Knight Returns, Ronin is an absolute mashup of manga influence and the Franco-Belgian influence of Jean Giraud, Mobius, you know,
Yeah.
all of that stuff.
Yeah. Well, no, and I mean, Miller, what struck me is those pictures of FDR that you showed, those look like a few drawings from Dark Knight. I mean, like legitimately Dark Knight pictures. I was like, wow.
Frank Miller goofing on Ronald Reagan is not that far.
For real.
And thank you, Matthew Murray. Yes, it was Keiji Nakazawa who did Gen of Hiroshima. And it was a short early work he did, a self-contained autobiographical reverie on the Hiroshima bombing that was published here as I Saw It. And that's the beginning of manga. Patrick asks if I'll ever publish a history of horror comics. I'll accept that question because manga would have to be part of that history. Actually, I'm working on a book series right now. I'll probably be self-publishing it. I've solicited some terrific, innovative work from a number of writers from outside of the US, including an overview of Brazilian horror comics and Australian horror comics. But with a lot of these self-starter projects, it's going to take me time to, pardon my French, get my shit together. So
We have Abu has his hand up. So go ahead, Abu.
Because in Japan there was this movement called Gekiga, the adult comics movement, Gekiga manga. So, what is your opinion about your favorite work from the Gekiga period, the adult comics, alternative manga?
you know,
Alternative
I
manga
could get in trouble answering this. I mean, you know, I guess I would go back to the 1960s with the early adult comics that Goro was publishing. So, you know, Lone Wolf and Cub and some of the gorier samurai manga that were done in the 60s, early 70s. Yeah, I'm into horror. So you can imagine what seeing Aratsuki Doji for the first time did to the top of my head. You know, I saw the anime, which was released here as The Wandering Kid. And I first saw it as a bootleg that, please forgive me, Tim, that my friend Tim Truman, the creator of Scout, mailed me saying, Bissette, you have to see this. This is the most insane thing I've ever seen. And then I tracked down the Aratsuki Doji manga, which was very different from the anime. You know, that stuff is outrageous. It's offensive. It's meant to be offensive, very transgressive. But I think I'd have to go with the samurai manga because they're just, I've read 3 or 4 of them that were translated into English. I've read probably, you know, visually read 5, another 5 that I couldn't find translations of, but they're just brilliant, brilliant feats of storytelling. And they're probably more accessible to me, Abu, because I grew up watching, you know, Akira Kurosawa medieval samurai films, you know, The Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, Sanjuro. I mean, I love those films. So I'm drawn, no pun intended, to those samurai themed manga as well. So probably the samurai manga first, and then the horror manga would be favorites of mine out of that period. The later adult manga, particularly the ones that are, you know, that fuse really explicit sex and horror, you know, they change your hardwiring and mess you up, which is what I look for in horror. But conceptually, they don't stick with me the way that, say, Junji Ito's work has. I mean, I'm an addict with Junji Ito, and I just got to read The Drifting Classroom by another manga creator who's the hero for Junji Ito. So I'm familiar with the work that's available here, but there's so much of it. And I thanked my students at the end of the talk. I have to say that probably 95% of the new manga I was exposed to is because my students would show me work I had never heard of and I never would have heard of or seen otherwise. And I will not be able to remember any of the titles of any of it, but it all messed up my brain just mad. So.
Also, what do you think about the Osamu Tezuka's adult animated films like 1001 Nights and Cleopatra, Queen of Sex? Very experimental films by Osamu.
I love all that stuff. And if you've never seen Tezuka's experimental anime, you should really check it out. Tezuka ended up doing a lot of short experimental anime. They're quite adventurous. We only got to see them on film festivals, but now there's been a number of disc collections, you know, DVD or Blu-ray collections. Thank you, Matthew, again. Yumizu was the creator of Drifting Classroom, the name I was forgetting. The more experimental manga that Tezuka did during his lifetime is work that I enjoyed, but I have to say that Buddha is probably my favorite of his manga, you know, and it's massive. I don't recall how many volumes it was, but it was a huge work. And I read them all thanks to the Schultz Library, which is our our library at the Center for Cartoon Studies. I need to track down my own copies. But I do love Astro Boy still, The Mighty Atom. And I love it enough that I tracked down and bought used copies of every English language volume of Astro Boy. And one of my fun projects next summer is I'm going to read them all in order, which I've never done. So I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome. All right, we had one more question in here, and then we're going to do the giveaway.
Okay.
Let's see. The last one I just want to ask is James had a question. Steve, what was the manga that swiped Swamp Thing as a serial killer?
You know, James Wheelock asked that question. I don't recall, but you gave me a photocopy of it, my friend. And I do not remember the title of it. In fact, I don't think we knew the title when you gave me the photocopy of it, but I just found that photocopy. And it
I'd like to see it again.
Okay, I'll find it and I'll photocopy and pop it in the mail to you. It involves skating. It involved a skater, or yeah, it had something to do with skating. And there were two murderers slash rapists, and one of them had a Swamp Thing mask on, and it was obviously a Swamp Thing drawn from late in the Swamp Thing run when Redondo Studios was doing it. I can even tell what panels they swiped from. But yeah, that was hilarious, and I still have that. But the title was nowhere on it, and I don't remember you knowing what it was either.
Yeah, I just found it somewhere, and I was trying to find it again.
Yeah, I mean, I've got so many weird manga. I've got like this horror, this goes to Abu's question a bit. I've got like this horror sex manga called Lemon People. And I've got like 3 issues. I have no idea what it was sold as or what it was supposed to be. But it's that, you know, very disturbing, you know, archetype of the big-eyed cutie pie, innocent characters being violated by just god-awful stuff. But yeah, I remember that one vividly, Jim, and I stumbled upon that photocopy just recently. So I will do my best to lay hands on it again and get you the photocopy. Maybe somebody out there in the big wide world can tell us where it came from.
Awesome. So
Hey.
now what we're going to do, just two housekeeping, and I'm going to pass it over to SFT to read who our winners are. Our next one is Pencil Me In. It's graphic medicine. It's January 11th. That is a Tuesday, so please make it if you can. The other thing I would just invite you to do, we just had a short story writing contest, and on our Facebook, the winners are posted there. And then we are going to produce some chapbook copies of that with spot illustrations from our local artist here. So I just invite you. They're pretty cool. They're on the reanimation theme, which is what we're still on before we get to Afrofuturism for next year. So without further ado, here's Steve Tuckey. Thank you everybody for coming. We really enjoy it. Thank you, Stephen, for an awesome presentation. So
thanks.
over to SFT.
I'm glad my voice held out this time. By the way, I should let everybody know, I did get tested for COVID-19. I got the results last Friday. It was negative. I do not have COVID-19. It was a cold, and I'm still nursing myself with, you know, Ricola cough drops and green tea.
Hey, Stephen, before you take off, can you give a quick elevator pitch for the next talk? What you're thinking, kind of encapsulated?
Sure.
Because it looks really interesting, but I'm not exactly sure what you're going for. So
okay, there's 2 things I'm going to cover. Graphic medicine, for those of you who have never heard the term before, is a term that's been affixed to primarily autobiographical and some biographical works involving people who are struggling with, you know, some condition or aspect of their life that would have been called in past generation a disability. There are different terms being used today, and I did not mean that in any way pejorative. And it has evolved into a genre in and of itself. And the talk I'll be presenting is a combination of 2 talks. We'll have a break in the middle. The first part is a talk on how Alan Moore, John Tollivan, and I folded autism into one of our Swamp Thing narratives, and why we did so. Because there are a lot of questions revolving around graphic medicine and biography and autobiography and graphic memoir about who has the right to tell what kind of story. And I want to talk about aspects of that. And the second part of the lecture is I gave a talk during one of the graphic medicine conferences that I was invited to. This particular one I was at Dartmouth College a number of years ago. And I gave a talk on some of the very brave and adventurous works of graphic medicine, if you will, that were being done by some of our students and alumni at the Center for Cartoon Studies. Before we present that talk in January, I have to reach out to everyone and find out who will give me permission to present that in this kind of venue, because, you know, for some of those people, their lives have changed dramatically. They might not want that out there. What they might have been comfortable with being presented in an academic conference that's geographically localized might be something they're not comfortable with by presenting online that'll be recorded and out there. So that's why I've set it up as a two-part lecture, because I thought covering two aspects of this strange new field of graphic medicine might be of interest to folks, and it is a growing field. And you know, this would be works like My Cancer Year by Harvey Pekar and Joyce Brabner, Epileptic by David B. You know, I even suppose Alison Bechdel's new graphic novel would fit into the umbrella of graphic medicine, even though it's about, you know, how to stay healthy when you're doing this kind of work. So it's a very wide, growing, and vital genre and field in graphic novels, and this will be my shot at covering a couple of aspects of it. I hope that covers it, Stephen.
That was beautiful. Thank you. That's be very helpful. And for those of you here in the chat, Matthew Murray was kind enough to put a website for us to check out and do a little bit of homework before next time. So
I'm going to thank
that's
Matthew
awesome.
Murray, as I did in the chat. Matthew, you should probably be the one giving this lecture next time, but clearly you know your stuff. So
Excellent. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording right now so that we can then get to the giveaways. So let me hit
okay,
stop.
I'll shut up.